I work for Salesforce, as Mark said, and in my role, I get to talk to lots of customers. And among the things we talk about are sometimes products or capabilities that have not yet been released or gone generally available. So we put up this statement, it's a forward-looking statement, basically means do not make purchase decisions based on what we're talking about, but only on things that are generally available. So it's important to say that because I'm going to be speaking about a lot of things, and I hope it'll resonate with you. So I'd like to start with why am I qualified to have this conversation with you? I know one of the tangents of this is intellectual property. And of course, we're talking about artificial intelligence. And so the reason I feel compelled to have this conversation is because I've done a little research, and in my role within Salesforce, I work with lots of customers. We're in this AI practice. We're in this age of generative AI. But in the background, prior to joining Salesforce, I also worked in system integrator. And among my day job, I also went and did things like writing books for the British Computer Society. And you might see a little avatar of the book right there at the bottom. It's called The World Beyond Digital Rights Management. And the reason and the time I wrote this, it was another, what shall we say, in disruptive technology that came at the time when music was being shared online illegally. And so fast forward to where we are now, looking at things like generative AI and the ability to come up with content that looks really compelling and very realistic, it started to bring back flashes of those days when companies were suing their customers, believe it or not. Anyway, in 2023, I wrote an article for the British Computer Society magazine called IT Now. And in it, I talked about generative AI. What is it? What has it got to do with intellectual property? And then what should we do about it? So I'd like to balance this conversation out with a little bit on intellectual property, a little bit on artificial intelligence, especially generative AI, and then look a little into how this impacts business and people, individuals. So it's going to be a little talk through this whole, I'm going to canter through the topics, and then let's have a conversation as we get to the end. Right. I want to start with the grounding. What is intellectual property? It's surprising how many times I speak to people in technology businesses, and they say things like, oh, we've got to look after our intellectual property. And they're referring to data within their systems. Fine. Maybe that's what they mean because it's property that they own within their organizations. But there is a definition of intellectual property I'd like us to kind of focus on as we go through this conversation. Here are some examples of intellectual property, not for you to read through, maybe when you get the slides, but maybe there are 4 types essentially I've put on screen. One is copyright. The other is patents, trademark, and trade secrets, because we're talking about businesses. Copyright is probably the largest of the lot because it protects works of authorship, works of the mind, things that have been created by people. And when you consider the likes of ChatGPT coming up, you ask it to tell you a story, you ask it to write a poem, you ask it to draw a picture now, you cover all the various models, Stability AI and Stability Diffusion, sorry, and various AI, generative AI offerings. They can produce things that really, look very, very real. So question is, who owns the copyright for those things? Is it the person who created the prompt? Is it the organization that had their data used to train the LLMs from which these things came? Or is it actually the person who has the software, the OpenAIs, the Geminis, etc.? This is a big vexed question at the moment, and lots of lawyers have their heads scratching, trying to get to the bottom of it. In a similar vein, patents are inventions and processes that are coming up with solutions to problems in a new way. And it got to the point where I think 2 years ago or thereabouts, somebody created a patent called Davos. And with Davos, he actually tried to get the patent for this software, this Davos software. And it raised a lot of eyebrows in the legal community because most of the jurisdictions basically said, no, it's a piece of software, it's not a person, therefore it can't own intellectual property. That argument is still going on. And so who owns it? Is it the operator? Is it the developer? Is it the person that actually, came up with a prompt or the instructions to get this new thing created? Again, similar questions. When it comes to trademarks, you have things like symbols, logos, watermarks, even within digital content. Some of these can become used by companies as their trading symbol. And those are protected intellectual property. And you've got to ask yourself, if AI generates them, are they, going to be sure that it's absolutely original, or is it generated from something else which it shouldn't? Again, questions out there. Trade secrets are quite interesting. Confidential information for organizations is key. It's critical. And you have regulations like GDPR that talks about privacy, the right to be forgotten, and all kinds of things. These are very real things for businesses to take into account when providing services to customers. Trade secrets obviously gives advantage to the owners of the trade secrets. And some of these models may inadvertently or purposely make it available when they produce their generated content. So if you think about it, intellectual property is tightly woven into the fabric of what we're calling generative AI. So what is generative AI? I won't bore you. It's really an evolution of the various types of artificial intelligence mechanisms, from machine learning to deep learning, natural language processing, all combining into something called a large language model. When you think about it, a large language model is, as the name says, based on language. And I want to come back to that point further on in the presentation. The thing I want to look at is something that Salesforce has put out there. Our CEO, Mark Benioff, actually presented this in Dreamforce last year, where he's talking about waves of artificial intelligence. And these waves are absolutely amazing to see how over the past, several years, we've had predictive AI. And predictive AI is pretty structured, it's embedded in our products and in other organizations that create AI capabilities and features. And now we have generative AI. One thing I like about the picture is that one is very structured, content, and the other is quite dynamic. And if you consider both of them, that's actually the nature of predictive, statistical, and generative, changeable, non-deterministic. These things have a reason for the way they're going to the right, because the next one is autonomous agents, which starts to go into the realm of being able to give instruction and trust that an agent will be able to carry out some instructions you've given it in a manner that is autonomous and you don't have to intervene. That's still, in the horizon, it's coming out. The last one is artificial general intelligence. And the good question mark there is we have no clue what that looks like. And I'm sure that's something to be explored as time goes on. So I want to pick out one more thing when it comes to change. Those waves we saw came slowly at first, and then it's increasing in pace. And that as it increases, it's interesting how people adapt to what they get. Over time, we've had all kinds of human-like interactions with systems, chatbots, robots, personal assistants, and algorithms. And we start to see the more we go towards the right, we're getting to a point where the interactions are getting very, very close to human. And so ChatGPT is one example. With the kind of output it produces, you start to understand where people start thinking this thing could be conscious or sentient or able to figure things out, but they can't, but it's getting very real. And so we're crossing what they're calling the uncanny valley. That has implications for how we interact with technologies going forward. Now, I'll switch out for a little to look at what this means in context of businesses and in context of people. Because when you interact with these technologies, some of the limitations and some of the constraints start to surface. Essentially, you have things like bias, hallucinations, as we all know from the generative AI, conversational AI things, and some headlines that go along with that. It's not hard to miss. Every once in a while, ChatGPT gets a bit stroppy and throws out some things. Organizations, chatbots start to swear at their consumers. And sometimes the mechanisms that you have in place may not actually work the way you intend. These are unintended consequences, and they have real impact on people. Toxicity, piracy, moral rights for creators, sustainability even. These things are very real and make it such that when you talk about generative AI and the evolution of artificial intelligence, it's not just intellectual property. It's not just about business. It's also about people. And so at times like this, I go up into the notion that things can get lost in the digital noise. And it's our job, our responsibility to make sure that no one gets left behind. In this picture here, you could say it's something a colleague of mine put together. She's one of the leaders in our artificial intelligence practice. One of these houses is crying out for help. And it's not always obvious when somebody is being excluded. So you've got to think about people and their limitations when it comes to interacting with technology. This is critical because when we say we want diversity in what we do, the advantages of diverse input into innovation is actually very clear-cut. At the same time, you don't want to leave anyone behind. And sometimes those differences are they're not necessarily clear in front of you. So one of these houses, if you get a chance, have a look at the smoke signals and figure out which one is actually crying for help. It's not always obvious. So when it comes to AI projects, what we are starting to see is the type of problems you want to solve. Using of generative AI is actually specific to certain types of problem, and it's not everything that it will solve well. Predictive AI, we've already known, it's been there for a while. The combination of both actually gives you a lot more options. But what about the next wave of AI? What about the autonomous agents? What type of problems will they solve? So it's important to keep in mind the nature of situations we're trying to address using these technologies. And of course, at the heart of all the technologies is data. You've got to start with the data. You've got to start with the actual information that's contained there. You've got to consider the meaning of that information. And then as you go up that level of evolution of the data and where it's going, because you have data, you have information, you have knowledge, and some say wisdom at the end of it. Each time you go up that ladder, the implications get even more intense when something goes wrong. So getting your data right, absolutely key. It's a no-brainer. And then finally, where are the humans? What are the considerations for people? Some things are best done by humans right now. We're not at the point where we have a replica, although there's a service called Replicas where you can talk to an AI which is matched to your personality, and it sounds very real and compelling. Some people worry that could be a problem because some people might decide talking to artificial intelligence is far better than interacting with other humans. This is real. And so where humans, what are the constraints and limitations that AI systems have where human beings can augment it, and vice versa? It's been said that AI will not take over the world, but the person with AI is likely to have more of an advantage than others without. So if you start thinking along those lines, make sure the problem you're dealing with is right. Make sure you start with the data and keep people in the center. In Salesforce, we're calling it people at the helm, human at the helm, as opposed to human in the loop. We're not just being considered, we're actually helping to drive forward where this thing goes intentionally. The other thing to consider for a business is to think where the maturity is in that organization. And from this picture, the message we're trying to say here is it's not just about data and technology. It's really about how the organization functions. What about the vision? What about the tools? What about the talent and skills of the people? How do you govern it? How do you integrate? And an organization like Salesforce will give you a super stack of capabilities that can start from the data layer integration into the applications and out to the interactive user interface. All those are critical. They must come together well. But you will find, regardless of how good the technology is, it's the people. And so when I talk to customers, it's really about making sure that that comprehensive look at what is required to make this thing successful is front and center right from the start. It's so easy to go wrong with these things because you're focused on far too narrow an aperture. The other thing is having trusted AI principles. Now, this goes, in my mind, back to values. Organizations should have values as much as individuals do have personal values, core values. We're at the point where technology makes it possible to actually extend your capabilities and make a difference into the world. And you want that to be guided in a way that is responsible. And that's where we talk about trusted AI principles. And these are the ones that Salesforce has. It's got to be responsible. You've got to be able to hold it to account. It needs to be transparent, no magic here, no black boxes here. It needs to empower people and organizations, customers, and your stakeholders. It needs to be inclusive. If you think about it, the power that this thing generates and makes available to ordinary users actually means that we're now in a very unique position to elevate everyone. And the mistake you make is in trying to keep it too specific to profit purposes, to business goals, which themselves are not necessarily broad enough to take into account what it means to be impactful to your community or to the world in general. Then you're going to miss the point. It's too narrow. And it's an education process that needs to be embedded into each organization. And we go at great lengths to talk about it with customers and to make sure that businesses appreciate the responsibility they have to make this thing successful, not just for themselves, but for their community at large. Okay, I'm going to wrap up a little with how we in professional services in Salesforce approach helping customers navigate this journey. First and foremost, we have something we're calling the AI coach. because this thing is still very new. And organizations are in different states of maturity and readiness to take on some of the journeys we're looking at here. And so the idea is we could do things like assess your readiness. We can help you with proving the technology, demonstrate the capabilities are suitable for your needs. And we can also look to build an actionable roadmap. So over time, you can take advantage of the capabilities that this AI brings to your organization. And so these are some of the things that make it compelling to have a partner that you trust who can walk with you on the journey. Another way we help customers is to inspire them, come up with workshops, help set the vision and get the readiness in place, map their journeys, assess and prioritize things, build roadmaps. But majority want to go into proof of technology. They want to see how this thing works. They want to see what it means for their organization. And they're not going to wait. So you've got to take that into account. Even as you're doing these experiments, you've got to think about what does it mean for your organization in terms of the vision, where you're trying to go, and what KPIs are you trying to address. And that also applies to certain of our customers who want to have an innovation lab, an AI lab, the ability to experiment with multiple LLMs, the ability to come in with their own LLMs and put it into the mix and get something meaningful out of it. And so last thing I want to say about this is we also have the idea that each customer has their own blueprint. I'm sorry for the picture and the slides, it's a bit off, but each customer has should have their own blueprint, because this is where you actually mark out the value stream that you're trying to explore in your own customer's journey, starting from acquisition right through to post-sales servicing. What are the KPIs? What are the touch points and the various organization aspects that you involve in trying to deliver these things? And what about the systems and data? That's what you need to give a solution that goes from the beginning to the end and addresses the problem you're trying to solve. And so the last aspect of this is, what about the future? Now, these are some thoughts I had over time, and it's personal, it's just stuff I come up with, but I'm finding that in some ways, it's good to look back as much as look forward. And so if you start with the evolution of human communication, generative AI is right at the heart of communication. If you start with what it means to have language, to have symbols, writing, print, broadcast, all these are part of humanity's evolution, cultural evolution to where we are today. And it goes then into where digital communication comes into it. And of course, the evolution of artificial intelligence is taking it to the next level. So this was a picture I included in that book I showed at the beginning. And at the time I did this, it was quite, telling that this digital communication actually has every single one of these represented in this realm. So it goes right back to language. You've got computer languages, signs and symbols, you've got the emojis, writing, you've got all kinds of prose in there, reproduction, print, broadcast, telecoms, everything is replicated here. And the next cloud coming through here is the artificial intelligence part of it, the generative AI, each time is a replication of the one that goes previous. So if you want to look ahead into where this is going, it's easy to start thinking, well, we've seen this stuff before, more of it's likely to come out. So what does this mean with those technologies, the Vision Pro, the Meta, what do you call them, the artificial augmented realities and virtual realities and meta realities that are out there, extended reality devices, augmented with artificial intelligence. And it starts to tickle a little in the head. I've been an architect for a lot of my career. And so I look at things with an architectural lens. When I think of intellectual property, I'm actually looking at what could the future of intellectual property be in a world where we have technologies that can create things original to a certain extent from their own, in their own volition, raised by prompts. So the most important thing there is value. Why would you create anything? What's the value in what you create? Personhood is the consideration that who owns the right, who should own the right, and what right are we talking about? It's really important, because if you don't establish that and you don't establish the value of it, then it's not really going to happen, or it won't have any meaning from where we are. You've got to think about the data. So as an architect, I start to look at the concerns. When you talk about value, it's the why. And you talk about the person, it's the what. Okay, and then you look at the data and the technologies, it's the how, which takes you to the right-hand side. For your systems of the future, you've got to be able to capture intent. So if you create a piece of content, if your organization works by creating content, you've got to understand what the intent is in there. You've got to talk about connectivity, which has to be trusted, transparent, and trackable. And then you look at agency, autonomy, the ability to affect change in the environment. So you start to see the evolution of IP in a future where it's all connected, but it needs to have that intent clearly stated. It needs to have trusted connectivity, so you know where things are going and coming from. And then with agency, you can then affect change to the world. And so I then look into that future and say, if you squint hard enough, we already have some of the, I guess, components of that type of a system, where if you consider how these will interact with each other, you could say something like artificial intelligence will be the intent layer. Talk about things like blockchain, trusted connectivity, and then Internet of Things to affect change. That's the agency. And in my mind, only then do you start to have the notion of general purpose technology. Weirdly enough, it has the same three-letter acronym as generative pre-trained transformers. I don't personally believe that that is a general purpose technology yet. It could become so, but more so when it starts interacting with these other emerging technologies, including quantum computing potentially. And that's where I feel the future is heading. And it's quite exciting to be in here at this time.
That was such a fantastic presentation. I was backstage taking so many notes. I have so many comments and questions. Wow, incredible. Okay. You blew my mind right there at the end with the GPT from generative pre-trained transformer over to general purpose technology. And that ties right into the slide that for me was one of the most impactful coming out of Dreamforce at the end of 2023, when Mark was on stage and showed the various waves of AI. I mean, I took a picture of it and I made a post about it. It was, to me, it's so remarkable to take a step back and look at what's happening, over the past year or two with all of everything that's going on with the explosion of generative AI, and look at it from that broader sense and really understand the progression of waves that we're in. I guess I just have a few comments here, but expand, at all around that. I mean, what the autonomous agents and then AGI? I mean, is this really where we're headed, and how far off are we from this? What are your thoughts?
Thank you, Mark. That's a question that has been bubbling in the background. And the reason I feel it's become even more cogent is the speed at which generative AI showed up, right? Generative AI has been around for a while. I mean, some of our AI researchers actually wrote some of the underlying enablers that made it real and made it doable. And so if you start thinking about where that came from, it starts to make sense that what we're witnessing is the ability for technology to supercharge itself. Each layer and each evolution of technology actually taps into the one previous and then gives you extra capabilities. And that's what you see clearly with generative AI. So it only makes sense that if you start looking ahead, then the next iteration of these technologies, because I'm actually feeling they are iterative, it starts heading into where you can chain large language models to perform an action. You already have Auto GPT and the like, which will interact with you. Salesforce is coming out with Copilot, which actually enables you to have interactions with your projects and come up with things that the Copilot or assistant will help you to achieve. And so it's not a long stretch of the imagination to consider a period where you could have trained this thing so well that it becomes capable of performing these tasks in an automated fashion without necessarily your intervention. But you must be there to supervise it. And so at that iteration, you start looking at the next level, which is how general can it be? And so the thought process starts to take you to a point where it might get to a point where we have the capabilities to leave this thing to do what it's meant to do. But then we have the fear, what if it becomes a rogue thing? And those scenarios that Peter Schwartz, our chief feature executive, painted in films like Minority Report or Terminator. So those concerns are real. And worse are the ones that are unintended consequences of exclusion of others. And you start to become very wary that really the responsibility lies in us all to make sure that our voices are heard, and it's something that is taken into considerations when we go off and create these things. But I think the future is possible. It's just how do we want to go about it?
Well, and what you just said at the very end there really does tie back to what you're presenting on. This one struck me: humans at the helm. So instead of human in the loop, human at the helm. And to create the generative or the AGI future that we envision, which is very bright, humans have to be at the helm, and we have to structure AI in such a way and deploy it in such a way that we always keep this at the forefront of our minds. So I really appreciated, that when you brought that up, where are the humans? The humans have to be at the helm. And that kind of, I want to swing back a little bit. We just did a presentation on how to skill up. So one of the first things you have to do is take a look at the slide you presented on the AI trust principles. You've got to learn. First, we have to learn, and then we could go out and deploy, keeping humans at the helm. Just tying all these themes together. I mean, you had the slide on this one. I loved I think you said you included this in your book as well. It's the looking back at technology, or the way we communicate in all the different forms, and tying that into today and demonstrating that generative AI actually includes all of that. I thought that was very fascinating.
Thank you. Yes, definitely, because if you saw the model I shared looking at the evolution of AI in its various aspects coming into this thing called the large language model, it has so many levels of resonance, because if you think about it, human language, the way we're communicating now, is what changes minds. It's what causes wars. It's what causes revolutions. It's what makes people do things. And you could consider it as a way of programming people. And now you have a machine that can do that almost as well as people. It's time to wake up and take note that this thing we use to enable and improve ourselves is quite powerful. And so the first thing everybody should think about is, I need to get enabled on it. I need to understand how this thing works. I need to know what it could do for me and against me, so that I'm prepared for anything that could come out. And society as a whole has a responsibility to make sure that everybody is also on that path. So as an organization, as a business, your users, your employees, your stakeholders, your partners, you all have to be on the same page. And therefore, at the heart of it is the communication, or the language is the mechanism, but the intent, if you remember, the intent has to align to your values. It has to align to your personal values. It has to align to your organizational values. So Salesforce would say, our top trust value is trust, right? Number one there. And so anything we do has to have the awareness that trust is really key. which is why when it comes to AI, Salesforce has put a trust layer to make sure that we're not leaving our customers' information in the open to large language models that may do anything with it. And so that's embedded into how we do things. And so I think every organization needs to really examine itself. Every user, every individual, every person needs to re-examine themselves. What are my core values? What does this mean for me? And so when you use the tool and extend your capabilities with language to affect the world, it's got to be reflective of your core values. And I feel that's very strongly. So yeah, that picture is trying to paint and say that in a different way.
Well, I definitely think Salesforce is absolutely leading the way with deploying, a socially responsible and trusted artificial intelligence, and really setting the stage for other companies to follow. So, I mean, you make a really compelling case for it, especially when you say things like, and I'm quoting you here on this one, regardless of how good the technology is, it's the people. It's the people that deploy it that determine how the future looks using the technology. Um, we did have a question, Roland. I wanted to address this question from an audience member. This person is they're using a Salesforce org. They have cross border. It looks like their org is used cross border, so they're struggling with this challenge. And the question is this: how do you take a look at customized integration of data and AI when you have different countries, different cultures, different laws around the same org? And this is a problem that didn't, maybe it rhymes with other issues that we currently have, but AI is sort of almost compounding the issue here, going back to you talking about, when you deploy AI, there's going to be new regulations that are going to be applied, and different countries are going to handle that differently. So any advice or thoughts on that?
That's a really good question. And the number of times we have that being put to us by customers is becoming more to the fore, because people are really thinking hard about this. If I put AI in my organization and get it to do things, what about those concerns, the laws, the cultures, the people? Remember, it's language, and the same word may have a translated meaning in another language, but completely different outcomes and impact. So we have to be careful how it's done. In terms of Salesforce, I will say one of the things I like about the way we're going about this is this notion of the data cloud. So it's the ability to get data from different sources, to harmonize it, to unify it around the customer, so that when it's served into the platform and the AI, you have at least a level of confidence that the data you have for this customer is exactly what it should be. And so at that layer where you're using it, you've got to be able to put in the constraints, the limitations, the legality around where the data should and shouldn't come from. Interpretation of the laws needs to happen. And this is, again, is where the human at the helm comes into play. You could write the rules for the system, but the human has to evaluate it in order to make sure that it's meaningful and sensible when it's actually being used in reality for customers. So whatever you develop, you mustn't let that out in the wild without thorough, rigorous testing, because it's easy to make mistakes. Then the headlines come, and then you spend a whole fortune trying to track back. And that's one of the key advices I give each time.
Yeah, we don't want the headlines. If we can avoid those, that would be great. But swinging back to IP and protecting IP, I thought it was great the way that you sort of laid out, what exactly is IP. And you said that IP is tightly woven into the fabric of generative AI. You referenced or alluded to the potentially, court or maybe I was just thinking this as you went through it, the court cases that are going on around, if you get a generation out of AI that's copyright material, what do we do with that, right? I don't know. Has that been ruled on yet? Are you following any of that?
I must say always, I am not a lawyer, so I'm following it with keen interest. And actually, I learn a lot about how um, the legal system works alongside, societal cares. It's by necessity, it's reactive because something has to happen, then it goes into the legal system, and then you work it out and you learn from it, and you have precedents, and that then drives the next case you come across. I say generative AI is tightly interwoven with intellectual property simply because it's generative. It actually creates something. It Because it's generative, it's not always original. In fact, you could argue it's generated from original content. And so the possibilities of having something that is copyright protected, for example, showing up in the output, that's there. And some of those lawsuits, I think it was New York Times, for example, against OpenAI, that's very much to the fore. That was the claim being made. And I think recently, what was it, yesterday or so, Reddit got paid some amount of money. Sorry, I can't remember the exact details, because there are content created within Reddit that may, potentially have shown up. And vendors and creators of these systems don't want to be infringing copyright, I don't believe. So they'll ask permission. And so maybe the mechanism to provide this permission should be improved so that it's easy for creators of artificial intelligence to access the information, data, content they need and use it the way that their users would want it presented. That could be the way this is evolving. But it's so early, and I think there's still more lawsuits to come. So it's interesting place to watch.
The future you described, where potentially original creators get compensated for the things that go into training models. That sounds like a great future. I hope someone's listening who could take action on that and do something with it. I really love that. You had a slide. We talked about the waves of AI. The other one that hit me really hard was the house crying for help, and this goes back to deploying AI and adopting this in an ethical and responsible way. It's really with any wave of technology adoption, there are houses that are left behind, unfortunately. And so I think it's really important, and I think Salesforce is doing a good job at this, right? Of deploying AI responsibly and in a social way. And you said it was a female colleague that had put together that slide with the house that's missing smoke, right? I assume that's the one that's missing smoke. I hope everybody else got that right too.
No. So yeah, I didn't get that right. I actually thought it was the house without smoke, but without giving it away, my colleague Joanna Kuiper, she came up with this image, and it was a way of actually expressing how easy it is to miss something quite obvious. So those houses are there, some with smoke, one without, some with different patterns of smoke, and then some with super structured patterns of smoke. They are binary. And so if you can decode the binary, one of the houses is saying, help me. And so it's a good way to represent how we can all be in this digital enabled world. We have our passports, we have our credit cards, we have our automatic coffee machines that know our preference, we have our mobile devices, but we don't always know when somebody is actually in need of help. Maybe it's because they are unable to use these devices, they don't have access to certain data, or some of the data they have is actually manipulated. So you have social media and the ability to manipulate what people see. That is the situation that we can easily miss in this world we are in now. And so it's important to keep that in mind when you're developing services for people. You don't want a situation where you're enabling that to happen. And so, yeah.
It's critical advice. Yeah, I think we're definitely in this pivotal moment in time as humanity adopts generative AI after predictive, looking forward to agents, and looking even beyond that to AGI. There's a lot of we have to do a lot of critical thinking and slow, steady steps to make sure we do it correctly here, or do it in the best way possible for humanity overall. Yeah. Well, Jude, I want to thank you so much for coming on and presenting. I know it's Friday night, your time. I'm sure you're ready to get off. Do you want to share any final thoughts with everyone before we drop here?
Oh, I just want to thank everyone for the opportunity. I'm really grateful. And I think the more we have these conversations, the more we learn from each other. So yes, I look forward to having more interactions in the future. I appreciate it. Thank you.